Hello and welcome back, and that is right, in this video I'm going to show you how to set up your UGREEN NAS for the very first time. This is technically going to be a 4-part series. In this first part I'm going to guide you through the physical and software installation and initialization of your device. I'm going to include some stuff on securities, installing applications, creating users, and creating your storage pools and your volumes and your shared folders. In part 2, I'm going to talk a lot more about backups, and in part 3, talk about multimedia. In part 4, well, that's up to you. More on that later on. But for setting this device up the first time, we're going to need the following few things. Number 1, we're going to need a UGREEN NAS. Bit obvious, right? The next thing, and this is weirdly optional, you need some storage drives. But fun fact, you don't need storage drives to boot this up the very first time. UGREEN NAS devices arrive with an OS SSD inside an M2 NVMe where the UGREEN NAS software lives. So if you are watching this and you have received a UGREEN NAS, now it's available for release, I think today. If you have got hold of one of these, but you're still waiting to get hold of your hard drives or your SSDs, you don't need to wait for that. You can set the device up and its software using the internal SSD and actually add the storage media later. So again, if you don't have your drives, carry on. But otherwise, you're going to need some storage drives, and if you're going to take advantage of M.2 NVMe's, you're going to need those. I'll show you how to install those later on. You're also going to need either a laptop, a computer, or a mobile phone to set the device up. Setup and initialization for the device is very straightforward and can be done via a mobile device via the UGREEN app, or taking advantage of a desktop appliance where you use their app or just the web browser. But more on that later on. Lastly, you may need a screwdriver. A screwdriver is going to be useful for if you want to upgrade the memory from its default 8 gig, or you want to install the M2 SSDs. More on that in a moment. And finally, you're going to need to ensure that not only has your power supply been attached to the wall, but we're not going to add that yet, but also that you have a network connection that is going into the router in your home, or a switch that is connected to the router, because you're going to need that later on to set the device up for the very first time. So, if you are going to take advantage of storage media on this and you are going to put in hard drives, installation of hard drives is really straightforward. With the exception of the little flash model, all of the drives that the system arrives with are click and load 3.5-inch SATA trays. Take the tray out, remove inside the little clip, pull that clip out, take your drive, make sure that the interface known as the SATA interface is pointing out. Slide the drive until the base of the drive touches the bottom of the tray and click the tray in. And that's it. That drive is now in the tray. Take that drive and slide it into the caddy. You'll know it's worked because the tray will remain flush. And then repeat that step with each one of the drives you're going to choose to install. Now, the more astute of you may have noticed that I'm only installing 3 hard drives inside a 4 hard drive system. The reason being, you don't actually have to fully populate these devices. You can go ahead and install just 1 drive if you choose, and then gradually over time add more drives to expand the storage system. So you don't have to fill all the bays, and moreover, if you're going to choose, for example, down the line to introduce a new drive for, say, hot swapping, a hot spare, which is when if one of these drives fails, it then picks up with the new drive you've installed in an empty bay and then rebuilds the NAS, you can do that. I strongly recommend when buying any NAS system, do not fully populate it. Always leave 1 or 2 bays empty if you can, simply because it will allow you to expand your storage later very easily, as well as introduce hot swappable drives. We'll talk a little bit more about RAID configurations in a bit and the advantages of having 1 or more pools, but just keep that in mind. Now, when it comes to the base of the system and upgrading the memory or upgrading to M2 SSDs, it's pretty straightforward. Take the system, which I'm now strongly regretting putting hard drives in first, but we play the hand we're dealt, and remove the 2 base screws located on the base of the system. This is the same on all of the 2, 4, 6 and 8 bay devices. Go ahead and remove the base screws. Once you've removed that dissipating panel, inside you'll find the memory modules bay there. You need to use DDR5 DIMM memory modules that exceed 3200 megahertz speed, all the way up to 52, perhaps even 5600. But also what you'll see are those two M.2 NVMe slots there. This is where you would go ahead and install M.2 NVMe's to be utilized either for caching or as their own raw storage pools. We will touch on this a little bit later in the video, but ultimately the advantages are with caching. If you have a drive installed for write caching means that when data is being sent to the system, that data is written to those SSDs first, and then internally that data is moved over to the larger but slower hard drives in the meantime. This will improve the speed of data being sent to the system long term. Now, read caching is when data that is more frequently accessed than any other data is copied, not moved, copied onto the individual SSDs. Now, that's going to be useful for databases where, for example, you're running multiple backups and VMs, or you have a team of users all accessing the same data. Then copies of that smaller metadata level, small scale IO is moved to there to make that access easier. You can use read-only caching or read and write caching. You can't use write on its own, and read and write caching requires 2 drives. Once they're installed, you can go ahead and close that panel. Also keep in mind that as good as caching is, you may see the benefits in instead utilizing a system known as storage pools and M.2 NVMe's. Now, much like the hard drives we've installed, what that would allow you to do is create a super fast area of storage, taking advantage of Gen 3 or Gen 4 SSDs inside these systems, which you can then run applications from. You can run as an editing disk, taking advantage of 10 GBE or dual 10 GBE, or some of the larger systems that allow for even more storage cards. You can even go ahead and use one SSD for caching, for read caching, and another SSD as a storage pool, again, for faster VMs, faster app deployment, and more. But there you go. We've set up the device in terms of hardware. What next? Well, the next thing we need to do is get this connected to our network. We go ahead, we get our network cable first, and insert it inside one of the ports. Which port you choose doesn't really matter, because if you have, for example, a 2.5G and a 10G port, if you've got a 10G switch, run into the 10G. If you've got a 2.5 gig or a 1 gig switch, use the 2.5 GBE. Ultimately, you can connect to both of them if you choose to the same network and take advantage of load balancing, link aggregation, port trunking, and other methodology as well. Once you've got that connected and it's connected to the local area network via a switch or a router, go ahead and grab your power cable and connect your power cable into the available slot. Once that's connected and you've got the device set up in the area you're going to be continuing with, go ahead and click the power button. Once you've done that, I've not turned it on at the wall, don't worry, but it will start powering on, and in around about 2 minutes, the device is available on the network. From here, we're going to move over to a desktop, but I will touch on mobile installations. Let's go to the screen. Once you've got onto the desktop of your laptop or just general computer, PC, Mac, etc., head to ugreen.com/pages/app download. And from here, you'll be able to download the client tools that allow you to set up your UGREEN NAS for the first time. You can get it for Mac there, Windows, again, depending on your CPU, all the way through. Now, we did cover the mobile installation on a separate video a while ago, and I might include an updated version of this, but from what I can see, setting the device up with a mobile is exactly the same. So I'll link to this in the description, and that'll show you just how easy it is to set it up for a mobile device, but pretty much all of these steps will be the same. Once you've downloaded the UGREEN NAS app for your operating system of choice, go ahead and open it up. It's a quick installation. It'll just be an exe file. Install, double click, and you're ready to rock. This app allows you to not only search your local area network to find a UGREEN NAS to set it up for the first time, but also if you do have an existing UGREEN NAS, you can also use it to bridge them go into them without a web browser, and a bunch of other cool little things. The other thing I'll highlight, and this is something that isn't necessary but is useful, is a tool called Advanced IP Scanner. I recommend you check this out, as the Advanced IP Scanner tool allows you to scan your local area network for different network devices, and later on when you want to connect your NAS to perhaps another NAS for backing up, it's going to be really useful. Now you've got the UGREEN NAS app open, go to New Device Registration, and it will find devices on the local area network. Now go ahead and click this button here, Register. Once you click that, it will open up in a brand new tab, and as you can see here, this is the window displayed here. This is still utilizing that application. Now before we go any further, it's worth highlighting that if you don't want to use the client application to set it up for the first time, perhaps you don't want to install a third-party app on your network, then go ahead and use Advanced IP Scanner to find the network attached device on your network, or access your switch or router to find out the identity of your NAS on the network. Once you've done that, you're going to be able to then, from there, after you find the UGREEN NAS, as I've done here, you can go ahead, take that IP ending 192.168.1.216, and instead go into your web browser and add that number. Take those numbers and then enter that into your web browser, and you'll find the NAS here on the network. So just keep in mind, although the rest of these steps are going to take place using the UGREEN app, it's worth highlighting that you can do it on the web browser. Now, one way or another, whatever way you're looking at it, go ahead and select that you've read the terms and conditions, because unfortunately you're not going to be able to install the software without doing so, and then click Start. From there, give your device a name. Change it, leave it as it is, it's really up to you. Next, create an administrator account. Now this is not the default admin. This is just a super user that isn't in any way hard locked. Go ahead and give yourself a name. I'm going to use the word admin but spelt slightly differently, and then give this account a password. This will allow you to create a singular account that's got full powers, but you can then later on create sub-accounts with less power that you can use for different devices, to lower your attack surface and reduce attack vectors. Then click Next. From here, it's now binding and creating this new administrator account. Now, if you want to set up remote access to your NAS device, as well as get notifications for when things happen on your system remotely over the internet, you can use UGREEN's own relay server to get that information sent to you. If this sounds like something you want to do, you can go ahead and enter that information here. Alternatively, you can use third-party services that are containerized, such as Tailscale, TeamViewer, and more. But if you do want to utilize this, go ahead and enter an email address. This is our disposable Google account we use for our videos, and then from there go ahead and click Get Code. You'll get the code sent to your email, and you can go ahead and enter that code there, and that will bind that remote access account, as well as getting those remote service notifications there directly remotely over the internet. But if that doesn't sound like something you want to do, and you only want to use your UGREEN NAS locally, go ahead and click Skip. It will warn you that you're not going to be able to access the device remotely, but remember, you can still access the device on the local area network. Go ahead and say you want to skip. From there, it will invite you to update your system to the latest firmware. Now, you don't have to do this, but I would recommend you do so. The reason being that as any software, not just UGREEN but anywhere in the world, as software arrives, attackers are trying to take it apart, try to find vulnerabilities in Linux, trying to find vulnerabilities in individual apps, and as those vulnerabilities inevitably are found, software updates then patch those, and then the cat and mouse game begins. So I would always recommend that not only do you have that the system installs updates, but you install the important security updates. You can either choose all updates, which again may be feature read, but not necessarily security linked, or just the security links. You can choose, if you wish, to just know when an update is out there and manually install it, but personally, I would say the most important updates should be automatic. Keep in mind that when an update does apply to the operating system, the system will need to reboot, whereas individual apps may need to be restarted for updates. A full firmware update for the system will force the system to reboot. On a Windows system, you may be invited to allow the system an opening in your firewall. Again, this will be monitored by Windows, and the same will apply to Mac systems. Again, give it access to those private networks on a local area network, but if you want to restrict remote access privileges, for example, if you end up using an internet service provider or a third-party internet service provider like a hotspot, that you don't want to invite access to your NAS, make sure you uncheck that. But if you're in a secure location, go ahead. From here, you're now at the main dashboard of your UGREEN NAS. It tells you where the apps are, exactly how to create your storage, file manager, and more. And all of these are just ways in which you can make the most of your system. But as you can see, the next thing it's inviting you to do is use the volume creation. Now, I'm going to switch over to web browser now, because although everything can be done here using the UGREEN app, I think it's better to use the web browser, as most of the time that is what you're going to use to interact with the system remotely. So let's switch to the web browser now. Now on the web browser, all you need to do is enter that IP we mentioned earlier on to access your NAS. You'll then be invited to enter the login credentials you created earlier on, and then from there log into the device. Now if you need further support and assistance on what to do with your device, you can use the help icon here at the bottom right that will guide you through some of the steps for setting the device up. But the next thing we need to talk about is storage, because even though this system's got some drives inside, we still have got to go through the steps of making our areas of storage. So head into the storage manager. From here, we're going to need to create a storage pool, a volume, and then finish. Click Start. Next, we need to select our RAID type. This will give us different advantages and disadvantages. Now, RAID 1 and RAID 5 effectively give you one disk of failure protection. So if one drive dies, you don't lose all of your data. What it means is the data that has been spread on the other drives in the system, and a RAID 1 applies to 2 drives and a RAID 5 applies to 3 or more drives, the system can still access your data until you're able to insert a new drive to repair your crumbled RAID. If you go ahead with a RAID 6 option, which isn't present at the moment because I don't have more than 3 disks in the system, that will give you 2 drives of failure. A RAID 0 combines all the drives into a single storage array that gives you heightened performance, but unfortunately has no failure protection, so use that at your peril. But for now, let's select our RAID 5. From here, select the disks that you're going to choose to use. I've got 3 24 TB drives as mentioned earlier. Select them and they're good to go. From there, choose if you want to test the disks in advance. Again, that's up to you, but it will take time. And then click Next. From there, say how much of the capacity of these drives you want to use. Now, you may want to use different volumes. A volume is a container that lives on top of the storage pool. Think of the hard drives as the ground and the volume as individual houses. Do you want to create one giant house with all of your storage, or multiple houses? Perhaps one for multimedia, one for backups, one for virtual machines. Choose and separate the storage available up to your own circumstances. Next, file system. The file system will depend heavily on what you really want. ext4 is the older file system and does give you better performance. However, BTRFS only gives you a smaller dip in performance, but does have inbuilt checksums happening with data as data is being transmitted through the system, and if an inconsistency during a write operation is discovered during the course of that write, BTRFS will repair it. It's just a case of if a 0 or a 1 is written incorrectly at the beginning and the end of the transaction. So BTRFS will give you that, as well as better snapshot support, something we'll talk about in a moment, and faster shared folder recreation and duplication. From there, click Next. As you can see, this is our configuration. We can go ahead and click Done. It will then format the drives. It will invite you to enter that super user password from earlier and then click Confirm. And now we're creating our storage pool. Now keep in mind, once the storage pool is created and the storage volume is created, the drive storage creation isn't actually complete. In the case of a RAID 5 or a RAID 6, it actually takes quite a lot of time to synchronize the drives. We'll be able to access our area of storage in the next few minutes, but we won't be able to achieve the real performance possible until the synchronization of the drives is complete. Now, depending on the number of drives you choose to use, that will take anywhere from 6 hours to 24 hours. So keep in mind that, as you can see, even though the pool is created and the volume, those little containers or houses of data are being created, the synchronization here is going to take time. And until that's completed, the performance of your storage media is going to be compromised ever so slightly until synchronization is complete. If you wish, you can go into the advanced settings here, and then if you choose, you can prioritize the RAID synchronization to speed up this process. But again, keep in mind, if you prioritize the RAID synchronization, that means a lot more of your CPU and memory resources are being used on this task and not others. Finally, down the line, there's an option here for quick repair. Quick repair is when, in the event of one of your drives failing and you introduce a new drive to repair the system, quick repair, instead of trying to rebuild every single block, every single 0 and 1 on all of the disks, regardless of whether the disks were full, quick repair will only focus on the areas of the disk where data actually existed. So if your RAID was perhaps 100 terabytes, but you only had 10 terabytes of data, quick repair will allow you to speed up the repair process by only having to build the 10 TB of data and then zeroing out the rest of the disk. Whereas a full RAID sync will be a lot more systematic and is arguably a much more consistent business class choice. Nevertheless, for non-prioritous utilization, quick repair is still a valid option. Now, it's worth highlighting that if you have M.2 NVMe's installed inside your system, these can also be used as storage pools. Alternatively, you can use them to create areas of caching. These areas of caching can be utilized to speed up read and write performance on your disks. So here we can add on here the individual statuses of our volumes, individual statuses of what our systems are doing here in the background. But a new option would be caching when you've got those SSDs included. Again, whether you want to use caching or not is really up to you, and I've done whole videos on whether benefits of caching, but I would argue that for some of you that are going to be creating areas of virtual machine storage and containers, or you're going to be having some apps running exclusively on the system, I personally would create a storage pool with those SSDs in order to let individual apps and services run on them. Next up, earlier on I mentioned, if you're going to be running multiple processes on this system and multiple users, I strongly recommend creating individual users for low priority purposes. Go into the control panel, go into user management, click add, and then create a new user. So for example, create a user called Plex. Give this user a password, and that password now, give them an email if you choose, but it's not important. You can make sure that this user either has full power or domestic power. This means that if that user was compromised or the device that they're on was compromised, that means they're not going to have full admin power to harm your system. So that's highly recommended if you're going to be utilizing different apps and processes where, for example, if you're giving access to your Plex server on a family member's phone and their phone gets infected with malware, then that means they're not going to be able to do much. You can actually limit that they can only read data and not write data and more. Go ahead and create a personal folder if you choose, if you've got family members who are going to be uploading their own photos to their own directories. From there, click Next. If you have individual shared folders, they will appear here to give them access. We'll come to that in just a moment. And the same goes for apps and other services on the system. Now, heading into the file manager, we're going to need to create ourselves some shared folders. Shared folders and personal folders and user folders all give you different levels of access and control. So for example, while we skip this tutorial, we can go ahead, come out of that one, and we'll start from scratch. So from here, first enabling the personal folder. The personal folder is going to be useful to you, the user accessing the system, for your data to go into preset locations. Again, you can say whether personal folders will apply to all users or not, but go ahead and either give them limited amounts of data space or complete and total access as needed. Now, a shared folder is a different kind of folder. This is a folder that can be accessed outside of the NAS using domestic and indeed business class file protocols such as SMB, FTP and more. Click New Folder and select New Shared Folder. Give the folder a name. Select the location, so if you've created multiple volumes of hard drives or SSDs, select them there and give it a recycle bin if you choose. And from there, click Create. We've now created that shared folder. This shared folder, we can then choose who can access it. So for example, I'll ensure that my admin user, the one that I created earlier, has full access, but the Plex can only access read. So it can see the data, play the data, but it can't affect or change the data. From there, click OK, and there you go. We've created our new test folder there. Right click if you choose, and you can get more information about it or change the permissions as needed. Next up, installing applications and services. Head into the App Center here, and you'll see the range of applications currently available from UGREEN on their NAS system. Some will be already installed, and others are just waiting to be installed. Now, if you're going to be taking advantage of, say, Plex Media Server, go ahead and you'll install right now the Docker application, because right now there is no native Plex application. So for example, in this case, I would want to install Docker. Select again which volume you want to use, and if this is where, if you've got SSDs in a pool for faster actions and faster apps, this is where you would choose that SSD volume. Click this if you always want apps to run from a volume you choose, and then click Install, and it will install it. Now opening a new tab, we can open up Plex and UGREEN, because I've already done a full setup of installing Plex on a UGREEN NAS, and this guides you through the entire installation process here. But this is a great example of how to install applications via Docker as well as virtual machines as well. Back on the UGREEN NAS GUI here, we can wait until that's done, or we can try something else. So while that installs a Docker application there, why don't we go ahead and talk a little bit about security on the system. Security on a NAS is tremendously important, not only if you give it remote internet access, but also for local access in case a compromised local device could hurt your system. Go into the Security tab, and from here, go through a number of these options. For example, you can choose auto block, which means that if a password is wrong a given number of times, it will automatically block a given IP or remote or local address for a given period of time. And you can manage a lot of those rules as well as blocking individual IPs permanently if you choose. So if you know, for example, that a certain IP is wrong and meant to be blocked from your system for whatever reason, you can add it there. Don't add 444, it's up to 255. You can even add a limitation in terms of time. Same goes for managing them over time if you want them to be whitelisted permanently, or what happens after a given period of time. Again, you can run security policies or ensure that certain levels of encryption and security are in place for any device accessing the system. Firewall controls can be enabled or configured here, as well as on your router if you choose to, but this is something for a much broader video, because covering this here would probably take longer than this entire video. But for now, if you don't know what you're doing, do not check that. And next, certificates. This is when you're accessing the system remotely. So, for example, you may have noticed at the top left it says not secure when I'm accessing this system. On the local area network, I've not applied a certificate, a secure certificate, which means that all the things I do between my local PC and the NAS are encrypted. If I want, I can install a local certificate from a company like Let's Encrypt, which is completely free and allow me to have secure transmission locally on the network between my laptop and the NAS. That's useful, but not essential. It's really down to the security of your in-house systems. But for remote access, if you're going to use the UGREEN remote access relay server, luckily they have already applied the certificate here. There were debates online, and you can find out more about it by looking, if we look at UGREEN certificate, we made a whole article on this, because we were slightly worried about the certification and the keys and duplication that was happening on UGREEN systems. This appears to have been resolved, but nonetheless, do take a bit of time to read up on the certificates being used on UGREEN systems and how they've changed over time. But moving forward, at this time, the UGREEN NAS systems do not support two-factor authentication on their systems. You can do a little bit of changing to the desktop there, change a lot of your user profile information and password control, as well as edit some of the rules for passwords, but at the moment there is not two-factor authentication. They do have two-factor authentication available within the UGREEN remote service, but as for local services, you're not going to be able to use your own OTP, 2FA or two-factor authentication on this system currently. Carrying on with security, in the control panel, head into the Update and Restore tab, and you can always check from here about new updates as they arrive. So if you didn't want to go for the automatic application of updates, you can do so here. But on top of that, always make a point of backing up your configuration. You can back up the configuration locally to a USB drive, or you can back it up to the cloud service using your UGREEN NAS account. Doing so, and you will need the internet to do it, will mean that in the event that you have to restore your entire NAS, the configuration options from users to account control can still be restored. But just keep in mind this does not extend to general backups and your actual data. It only extends to the configuration. Next up, head into the Terminal tab. In terms of security, do not have Telnet or SSH enabled unless you need them. These are tools that are used for accessing command line levels of access to your system. Do not enable them unless you need them, okay? So if these are on and you're not using them, have them switched off. If you've decided you do want to access the system remotely, head into Device Connections. From Device Connections, not only have you got the ability to rename that NAS and therefore find out its local and remote access IP, but on top of that, you can head into the Remote Access tab here, and then from here, enable that remote access via the UGREEN servers, but of course, you will need to create that UGREEN account. On top of that, you can enable DNS support. But again, these are things that if you don't know what you're doing, I don't recommend you play around with them. And the same goes if you want to change the the port. By default, a lot of NAS systems use a default IP. In this case, we've got 9999. That's being utilized for the local port when getting in. It's highly recommended to change that to a random number, and the same goes for remote access as well, as this will help to lower the attack vectors as much as possible. You can also ensure that all connections are HTTPS, in other words, utilizing encrypted protocol, but again, you will need to take advantage of encrypted certificates locally if you want to utilize that. And as you can see, the options really go from there. You can add all kinds of encrypted protocol to your system for accessing the web portal there. But again, not all of these apply to remote, and some of them are local protocol. If you don't know what you're doing, just go ahead and make sure you change that port, which will change that number there at the top, and move forward. And again, remote access can be enabled later on. And lastly, this isn't really a security thing so much as a stability thing, but by default, your NAS will be utilizing a dynamic protocol. That means that although right now the network address for this is ending in 216 locally, if the system reboots, if devices move around on the network, or your router or switch reboots, this address might change. So if you want the NAS to never change its identity on the network, go ahead, click Edit, and then select a manual number here and change it at the end. But keep in mind, if you change that number and down the line you move to a new switch, move to a new router, that can be problematic. You do see performance benefits on a static IP, but keep in mind that if you move the NAS to a new location, you will have to go back into the UGREEN NAS app and can reconfigure that network identity from scratch. Finally, if you do want to enhance some of the performance of your system, go ahead down to the bottom of this tab and change the MTU, otherwise known as the jumbo frames, and via a 10 GBE connection, change that number to 9000. Also do the same on your local PC if you're connecting via 10 GBE, as this will allow you to change the performance and block size capacities and enhance the volume of it a little bit. On Windows, you can follow it the way I've done here on the screen and change that to 9000. But don't do it if you're not using a 10 gigabit connection, as you won't really see the benefits and it can actually overcomplicate things. Returning to the file manager, it's worth highlighting that you should take this opportunity to go into the shared folder area and start creating folders for your multimedia. The system will create some, But nonetheless, you can go ahead and create your own ones if you choose, or if you go into the user folder, you can start creating folders accordingly. So for example, go ahead and create a new shared folder and call this one music. This music folder obviously is where your music is going to go, and then click create. From here, you can then choose that again, those users or those individual app users that we're creating earlier to have as much or as little access as we choose. Again, you can create these folders in the user folder or the shared folder area. If you plan on accessing these folders via a multitude of different means, again, such as SMB, then go ahead and put them in the shared folder area. But for internal access, use the user folder option. From shared folders, we can go ahead and create ourselves some new folders moving forward. So for example, video, we'll go for that one there, and we'll go through the same steps we just went through. And finally, we'll create another one for music. We've now got, not music, we want to go for photos. Keep in mind that later on, if you install the Photos application, that will in turn create its own folder, but you can synchronize those internally. Now, adding data to the system is incredibly straightforward. For example, if we go into the photo section here, from there, we can go ahead and choose several different methods to add data to this folder. Number one, we can literally go ahead, grab a folder if we choose, and drag and drop it into the window. It will then upload those files directly onto the NAS if we choose, which is what it's going to do here in the background as it creates thumbnails and indexes the files. Alternatively, go there, click the upload symbol, and then go ahead and click upload skip or upload overwrite, depending on if you're worried if the data is already on the system. Select upload overwrite, select a file, select open, and it will now upload that file to the NAS. It's that straightforward. And just like any browser, you've actually got quite a lot of different configuration options here. So for example, if you use the native right-click options, you can copy, you can paste, you can cut, you can add it into a compressed archive, you can find out more information about it via the properties from size to access privileges and more. If you want, you can go ahead and create a shareable link. Depending on whether you've enabled remote access to the system, it will change how that share link is created. You can add expiration, so the share will die after a few days, add a password, add an access limit, so a number of times it can be accessed. It's quite intuitive and there's lots of config options there. But again, depending on if it's a local user, depending on if it's a remote access user, the options will change. And if you are worried that files that you've created are duplicated, go ahead, go into Management and select File Duplication, and this will scan individual areas of the NAS to find data that is duplicated in different areas and remove those duplicates. It's a bloody useful tool, and deduplication means it doesn't actually remove the file from its original location. It merely keeps a record that a copy of that file is there, deletes the copy but also maintains the record. And that about wraps things up for part 1 in this series, the initialization of your UGREEN NAS. In part 2 of this series, we're going to be looking a lot more on backups, how to back up the content of your NAS to another NAS, how to back up the content of your NAS to a USB, how to take advantage of cloud backup services and cloud remote mount services and more. And in part 3 of this series, we'll be going through the multimedia setup of your UGREEN NAS. I hope you find this guide series helpful, and if you've got any suggestions for part 4, do let me know. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.